Ever wondered what life was really like behind monastery walls? Did medieval nuns truly give up everything for their spiritual calling? Number 10. Absolute silence. Could you imagine going days without speaking a single word? For medieval nuns, silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory. The rule of silence, silentium, was one of the most fundamental aspects of convent life throughout the Middle Ages. Many religious orders required their sisters to maintain complete silence for most of the day, with some monasteries enforcing this rule with extraordinary strictness. In Cistercian convents, nuns were forbidden from speaking except during very specific periods, usually just 1 hour per day. The rest of their waking hours were spent in a quiet so complete that they developed elaborate hand signal systems to communicate essential information. These sign languages became surprisingly sophisticated, with different gestures for hundreds of common items, actions, and concepts. The punishment for breaking silence could be severe. Minor infractions might result in eating meals on the floor, while more serious or repeated violations could lead to corporal punishment or isolation. The Benedictine rule, which many female monastic communities followed, stated that too much talking leads to sin, and emphasized that speech should be rare, brief, and only when absolutely necessary. This vow of silence wasn't merely about discipline. It was believed to foster a deeper spiritual connection. By eliminating idle chatter and gossip, nuns could focus entirely on prayer and contemplation. Their days were punctuated only by the sounds of liturgical chanting and readings during religious services. Many accounts from medieval mystics describe how this profound silence created space for divine experiences and visions. Some orders were stricter than others. The Poor Clares, founded by Saint Clare of Assisi in the 13th century, observed silence so rigorously that visitors often remarked on the eerie quietness of their convents. Even when speaking was permitted, nuns were taught to use few words and well considered. The ability to maintain silence was considered a sign of spiritual maturity and self-control. Number 9. Strict enclosure. What would it feel like to enter a building knowing you might never leave it again until death? For medieval nuns, the vow of enclosure, clausura, meant exactly that, a lifetime confined within monastery walls. After taking their final vows, many nuns never again stepped foot into the outside world. This extreme restriction began to be more rigorously enforced after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which formalized many aspects of monastic life. The physical barriers were imposing. High walls, barred windows, and heavily secured doors separated the nuns from secular society. In many convents, a rotating wooden drum, called a turn or wheel, built into the wall allowed objects to be passed in and out without the nuns seeing or being seen by outsiders. Visitors, when permitted at all, could only speak to nuns through metal grills or wooden screens that prevented physical contact and often obscured full visibility. Even family members might go years or decades without seeing their daughters, sisters, or aunts who had taken the veil. When Queen Blanche of Castile visited her daughter at the Cistercian Abbey of Maubuisson in the 13th century, she was only allowed to speak with her through such a barrier despite her royal status. The enclosure wasn't just physical, but extended to mental and emotional separation from worldly concerns. Nuns were expected to detach themselves from news, politics, and family matters. Letters from relatives were often read by the abbess before being delivered, and sometimes the contents were censored or letters withheld entirely if they were deemed too distracting from spiritual pursuits. The harshness of this isolation can't be overstated. Historical records contain accounts of women who struggled tremendously with this aspect of convent life. In the chronicle of the Dominican monastery of Tos, Switzerland, one nun described the enclosure as a prison that feels like a tomb. Yet for others, This separation created a profound sense of community within the convent and allowed for undistracted devotion to prayer. Number 8. Extreme fasting. How long could you survive on just bread and water? For medieval nuns, rigorous fasting was not just an occasional practice, but a way of life that pushed their bodies to the limits of endurance. Food restrictions in convents were among the most physically demanding aspects of female monastic life. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many orders, prohibited meat from four-legged animals except for the sick and infirm. During Advent and Lent, which together spanned nearly a third of the year, the diet became even more restricted. Many nuns subsisted on a single daily meal during these periods, usually consisting of bread, vegetables, and perhaps small amounts of fish. Some particularly austere orders, like the Poor Clares in their early years, abstained from all animal products year-round. Fasting wasn't just about quantity, but also timing. The single main meal was often not served until mid-afternoon, meaning nuns might work and pray for many hours on empty stomachs. Records from the Abbey of Barking in England reveal that during the strictest fasting periods, nuns received just 6 ounces of bread and a small cup of ale per day, barely enough to sustain an active adult. This physical deprivation was given spiritual significance. Hunger was understood as a form of bodily discipline that helped control carnal desires and created opportunities for offering suffering to God. Female saints, like Catherine of Siena, became famous for their extreme fasting practices, sometimes surviving on nothing but the Eucharistic host for extended periods. The gendered dimension of this fasting was significant. While both monks and nuns practiced dietary restrictions, women's fasting took on special meaning in medieval spirituality. Female bodies, considered more fleshly and prone to sin in medieval theology, were thought to require more rigorous discipline. This created a paradoxical situation where weakening the body through hunger was seen as strengthening spiritual resolve. Medical consequences were inevitable. Historical records and archaeological evidence from female monastic communities show high rates of anemia, osteoporosis, and other nutrition-related conditions. Yet despite this physical toll, many nuns embraced these practices willingly, seeing them as pathways to spiritual perfection rather than punishments. Number 7. Ownership of nothing. Can you imagine giving up not just your possessions, but the very concept of ownership itself? Medieval nuns took a vow of poverty that went far beyond simply living simply. It meant renouncing personal property entirely. Nothing, not even the habit they wore or the rosary they prayed with, legally belonged to them. Upon entering the convent, novices relinquished all worldly goods. Wealthy families often provided generous dowries to the convent when their daughters took the veil, but these women would never personally control those resources. Any inheritance a nun might receive after taking vows was immediately transferred to the communal property of the monastery. The physical manifestation of this vow varied by order and era. In the strictest communities, cells were furnished with only a straw mattress, a blanket, a prayer book, and perhaps a crucifix. Personal gifts were forbidden or had to be shared with the entire community. Even seemingly innocent possessions could become problematic. There are recorded cases of nuns being disciplined for having private stores of ink or parchment, or for keeping extra food in their cells. The constitutions of the Dominican nuns, codified in the 13th century, stated that no sister shall presume to give, receive, lend, borrow, or dispose of anything whatsoever without permission from the prioress. This extended to items as small as needles, or as personal as letters from family members. Regular cell inspections ensured compliance with these regulations. For noble women who entered convents, this transition could be especially jarring. Historical accounts tell of aristocratic nuns struggling to adapt to communal living after childhood surrounded by luxury. Christine de Pizan, the medieval writer, notes in her The Book of the City of Ladies how some noble-born nuns found the poverty of convent life to be their greatest challenge, yet ultimately their greatest spiritual reward. The psychological impact of this complete surrender of personal ownership shouldn't be underestimated. It represented a radical rejection of the emerging mercantile values in medieval society and created a distinctive countercultural identity for these women. By owning nothing individually, they participated in a communal economy that was increasingly rare in the developing market-based world outside monastery walls. Number 6. Constant prayer. What would it be like to interrupt your sleep every night to praise God? Medieval nuns lived lives structured entirely around prayer, following a demanding schedule of devotions that began in the middle of the night and continued at regular intervals throughout the day. The Liturgy of the Hours, also called the Divine Office, divided the day into 8 prayer services: Matins, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sext, Nun, Vespers, and Compline. The most physically demanding was Matins, which typically began around 2 a.m. Nuns would rise in the darkness, proceed to the choir, and spend up to 2 hours chanting psalms and reading scripture before returning to bed for a few more hours of sleep. This cycle of prayer was relentless and unchanging. Whether sick or well, in summer heat or winter cold, nuns were expected to attend these services. The Benedictine rule specified that even when traveling, which was rare for enclosed nuns, the hours must still be observed at their appointed times. Over the course of a week, all 150 psalms would be recited, along with numerous hymns, responses, and readings. Beyond these communal prayers, nuns were expected to engage in private devotions during any remaining free time. These might include reciting the Rosary, meditating on the Passion of Christ, or practicing contemplative prayer. Some mystic nuns, like Hildegard of Bingen or Mechthild of Magdeburg, developed elaborate visualization techniques during these private prayer sessions that led to their famous visionary writings. The physical toll of this schedule was considerable. Chronic sleep deprivation was common, especially among the elderly or infirm. Yet the psychological effects were complex. While exhausting, this rhythmic prayer created a sense of spiritual momentum and continuity. The 12th century nun Christina of Marciate described the divine office as the heartbeat of the monastery, suggesting both its life-sustaining nature and its relentlessness. Learning the complex liturgy represented a significant intellectual achievement. Nuns needed to memorize vast amounts of Latin text and music, often without understanding the language. Choir books were enormous and expensive. So many communities shared a single copy, requiring sisters to learn their parts by heart. This turned daily prayer into a sophisticated performance, requiring years of training to master. Number 5. Complete obedience. How would it feel to surrender your will entirely to another person? Medieval nuns took a vow of obedience that required them to submit completely to their superiors, without question or hesitation. This wasn't merely about following rules, it meant the total abdication of personal autonomy. The abbess, or prioress, who led the community, held extraordinary power over the daily lives of her nuns. Her permission was required for activities as minor as writing a letter, visiting the infirmary, or speaking during silent periods. The rule of Saint Benedict explicitly stated that obedience must be without delay, emphasizing that any hesitation represented a failure in this essential vow. This hierarchical structure was reinforced through rituals of submission. When addressing the abbess, nuns were expected to bow or even kneel. In some orders, like the Cistercians, sisters would prostrate themselves on the ground before the abbess when confessing faults or receiving instructions. These physical gestures reinforced the psychological submission required. The spiritual reasoning behind this extreme obedience was profound. By submitting to a human superior, nuns were symbolically surrendering to divine authority. The 13th century text, The Mirror of Simple Souls, explained that perfect obedience makes the soul naked of its own will and therefore more receptive to God's grace. This theological framework transformed what might otherwise seem like humiliation into a spiritual practice. Testing this obedience was sometimes built into convent life. Historical accounts describe abbesses deliberately giving contradictory or seemingly nonsensical commands to test the promptness of their nuns' responses. One famous example comes from the life of Hadwig of Antwerp, who was reportedly ordered to tend a dead plant daily for months without question, a test she passed by faithfully watering the barren sticks until eventually released from the obligation. For women from noble backgrounds, this requirement could be particularly challenging. Accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them, aristocratic nuns sometimes struggled to adapt to this inverted power structure. Convent chronicles occasionally mention disciplinary problems with high-born nuns who brought their sense of entitlement into religious life. Number 4. Extreme dress regulations. What happens when your clothing is designed to erase your individuality? For medieval nuns, the religious habit wasn't just a uniform. It was a complete transformation of identity that eliminated almost all personal expression and femininity. The process began dramatically with the ritual cutting of a novice's hair during her investiture ceremony. Long hair, considered a woman's glory in medieval culture, was shorn or completely shaved in many orders. This hair was sometimes preserved by families as a relic of the daughter they would rarely see again. After this symbolic separation from feminine beauty, the novice would be dressed in the community's habit, usually multiple layers of plain, coarse fabric. Color and quality were strictly regulated. Most orders wore undyed wool or linen in black, white, or gray. The Benedictines were known for their black habits, while Cistercians wore undyed white or gray wool that symbolized simplicity. The Poor Clares initially wore the roughest available fabric as a sign of their extreme poverty. These materials were often uncomfortable, scratchy, heavy, and difficult to keep clean with the limited bathing permitted in convents. The habit's design deliberately concealed the female form. Multiple layers included undergarments, a long tunic, a scapular, a long panel of fabric worn over the shoulders, and various veils and wimples that covered the head, neck, and often part of the face. The Dominicans, for instance, wore a white tunic and scapular covered by a black capa or cloak, with elaborate headpieces that completely framed the face. Customization was forbidden. Unlike secular medieval clothing, which often featured personalized elements even among the poor, religious habits were intended to be identical within each community. The convent's constitutions typically specified the exact dimensions, materials, and construction methods to ensure uniformity. Even small variations could result in penance. There are records of nuns being disciplined for adding extra stitching or slightly altering their veils. This standardization extended to practical matters. Nuns slept in simplified versions of their habits and were expected to maintain modesty even in private. In some stricter orders, they were forbidden from seeing their own bodies unclothed and had to bathe wearing a simple shift. The psychological impact of never being fully naked, even when alone, created a constant awareness of one's consecrated status. Number 3. Restricted contact with men. How completely could women be separated from men in medieval society? For nuns, this separation was enforced with extraordinary rigor, creating female-only spaces centuries before such concepts entered mainstream thinking. The restrictions began with physical barriers. When male visitors, even priests or high church officials, entered a convent, elaborate precautions were taken. Many monasteries had special parlors with double grills or screens that prevented any physical contact. Some had turntables where objects could be passed without hands touching. At the Cistercian Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain, even the king had to follow these protocols when visiting his royal relatives who had taken the veil. Male voices were similarly restricted. When confession was necessary, screens ensured the priest could hear but not see the nun. When male preachers delivered sermons in convent churches, they sometimes spoke from enclosed pulpits that prevented visual contact with the nuns' choir. At Santa Maria Donna Regina in Naples, architectural evidence shows how the women's choir was positioned to hear the sermon while remaining completely invisible to the male preacher. The few men permitted regular access to enclosed convents faced strict regulations. Chaplains, confessors, and physicians could enter only when necessary, and were typically elderly priests considered beyond sexual temptation. They were often accompanied by multiple witnesses to ensure propriety. Workmen making repairs were supervised constantly and limited to specific areas of the convent. These restrictions went beyond practical concerns about sexual misconduct. Theological writings of the period emphasized that feminine spirituality flourished best in the absence of masculine influence. The 13th century mystical text, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, by Mechthild of Magdeburg, describes how God spoke more clearly to women in spaces free from male authority and distraction. Yet there's evidence that these rules were sometimes strategically negotiated. Archives contain dispensations allowing noble nuns to meet with male relatives for estate management, and some intellectually active nuns maintained correspondence with male scholars. Elizabeth of Schonau and Hildegard of Bingen, both visionary writers, exchanged letters with prominent churchmen despite their enclosed status. Number 2. Harsh physical punishments. Would you volunteer for physical pain as spiritual discipline? Medieval nuns regularly engaged in bodily mortification and faced severe corporal punishment for breaking rules, practices that seem shocking by modern standards but were considered spiritually beneficial in their time. Self-inflicted suffering was a regular part of convent life. Many nuns practiced disciplines like wearing hair shirts, rough garments made of animal hair that irritated the skin, self-flagellation with small whips or knotted cords, and wearing metal chains or bands around their waists or limbs. These practices typically intensified during Advent and Lent. The Poor Clares were known for particularly austere practices. Some chronicles mention sisters wearing crowns of thorns during private devotions, or sleeping on beds of twigs. Beyond voluntary suffering, formal punishment for rule violations could be severe. The Benedictine rule, followed by many female monasteries, prescribed a graduated system of discipline. Minor infractions might result in temporary separation from community activities, while more serious offenses could lead to corporal punishment. This typically took the form of disciplinary flogging administered by the abbess or her deputy, often in front of the assembled community as a public humiliation. The physical architecture of convents sometimes included dedicated spaces for punishment. Some monasteries had small cells called prisons, where repeatedly disobedient nuns could be confined for weeks or months with reduced rations and required extra prayers. The Cistercian monastery of Las Huelgas in Spain maintained such a cell, where offenders were kept on bread and water until deemed sufficiently penitent. The severity of these punishments varied by order and era. Reform movements periodically addressed excesses in discipline. The 14th century Dominican reformer, Catherine of Siena, argued that overly harsh physical mortification could become a form of spiritual pride rather than true humility. However, even reform-minded leaders typically moderated rather than eliminated corporal discipline. What's particularly notable is that many nuns embraced these practices willingly, seeing physical suffering as spiritually. Hagiographies of female saints frequently glorified extreme bodily mortification. Angela of Foligno reportedly drank water containing pus from the wounds of lepers as an act of identification with Christ's suffering. While such extreme examples were outliers, they established cultural models that shaped everyday convent practices. Number 1. Permanent commitment. What would it feel like to make an irrevocable decision at age 14 that would determine your entire future? For medieval nuns, their vows represented an absolute commitment that could never be undone, often taken at what we would now consider a disturbingly young age. The permanence of religious profession was enshrined in both church law and social practice. Once a woman had taken final vows, usually after a probationary period as a novice, there was virtually no legitimate way to leave monastic life. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 formalized many aspects of this commitment, declaring that religious vows constituted a spiritual marriage to Christ that was indissoluble. The age at which girls could make this permanent commitment varied throughout the medieval period, but was typically much younger than modern age of consent. In the early Middle Ages, children as young as 7 could be offered as oblates by their parents, binding them to monastic life before they could possibly understand the implications. Later reforms gradually raised the minimum age. But even in the late medieval period, girls could take final vows at 14 or 15. Attempts to leave after profession were treated with extraordinary severity. Apostate nuns, those who fled their convents, faced excommunication and could be forcibly returned by secular authorities. Civil law in most medieval kingdoms treated escaped nuns as criminals. The chronicler Matthew Paris records how in 13th century England, runaway nuns were hunted down by the sheriff's men and returned to face penance and imprisonment within their communities. This permanence created situations of tremendous hardship for women who had not freely chosen religious life. Historical records contain heartbreaking accounts of women forced into convents by families seeking to avoid paying marriage dowries or to preserve family property by limiting the number of heirs. The 15th century writer, Christine de Pizan, warned parents against forcing daughters into convents, noting that many who take the veil without devotion live in perpetual misery. Even physical disability or severe illness did not release nuns from their commitment. When convents faced financial difficulties, as many did during the later Middle Ages, living conditions could become desperate. Yet nuns remained legally bound to their communities even when basic provisions like adequate food or heating became scarce. A letter from Pope Innocent IV to the Bishop of Lincoln in 1254 acknowledges the piteous state of certain English nunneries, but still forbids the release of any professed sisters, despite their suffering. Ever wondered what drove these women to accept such extreme restrictions? Did they find freedom within these rigid boundaries in ways we can hardly imagine today?